Quick demo of this tutorial. Here we are going to implement CRUD operations, insert, update and delete in latest ASP.NET Core MVC using Entity Framework Core. Same topic is discussed 3 years back. It won't work as it is because of the new updates in the framework. This topic is discussed with best practices that I have learned so far, and in this video I have discussed the solutions to most common problems or issues that you might have while developing this application. There are a lot of things to learn from this video, so definitely this will worth your time, so please watch till the end of this video. So here is my Visual Studio 2022. Now let's create a new project. Now select the ASP.NET Core MVC template in C#, which I can see inside this recent project templates here. If you can't see, we can do this from this language drop down, select C#, then under this project types, select web. Now you could easily see the template ASP.NET Core Web App Model View Controller in C# language. So this is the template that we are looking for. Now click on next. Now name this project here. In order to demonstrate CRUD operations inside this MVC application, we'll be using bank transactions. So I will name this application as bank transaction. Now select the location where you want to save this project. Make sure that there is no special characters inside this folder path directory here. It might cause unexpected errors in various stages of the app development. I had similar experience in past. So if there is any special characters inside these folders here, consider renaming them appropriately. Now let's go ahead with the project creation. For this project, I'm using the latest .NET 6 version. I will uncheck this HTTPS configuration since we are aiming this project only for the demonstration. Now let's create the project. So here we have the brand new ASP.NET Core MVC application. Before going forward, I would like to give you a brief introduction to this ASP.NET Core application here. So this project is built on .NET Core. Inside that we have this ASP.NET Core framework for building this MVC application. Now let's get familiar with the important directories inside this project. First of all, we have this www root. It consists of static files like style sheet, JavaScript files, and inside this library folder we will be having UI frameworks like Bootstrap or any other libraries. And here we have the icon for this application. And here we have the MVC part model view controller. We'll be discussing each of them in depth throughout this tutorial. Now this JSON file app settings contains the configuration details for this application like DB connection string. Finally, we have program.cs file, which is the starting point for the execution of this application. In previous version of ASP.NET Core, along with program.cs, we had a file startup.cs where we have done the most of the configuration for the application. But in latest versions, we don't have such a file, so we'll be configuring everything inside this program.cs file here. If you are using a previous version of ASP.NET Core with startup file, I'll be showing the alternatives on startup.cs file. Don't worry about that. Here you could see a web application builder is created. From this builder instance, the service for MVC is added, and thereby this application became an MVC application. Without this function invocation here, this would be a plain console C# application. And here we have started the build operation for this application. And here we have configured how do we want to show the error message if there is any, based on whether we are in development environment or not. You could customize accessing static files from this application with this function invocation here, and with this method we are configuring the routing for this application. If you need any authorization, you can customize this method here. And here we have the default routing configuration for this application. So the first part of the URL after the base URL will be the controller name, which by default is home, which you can see inside this controllers folder. And the next part will be the action name, which is index, and any query parameter after that will be considered as the ID parameter. You can see that in a bit. So this is the default routing for this application. At last, with this method invocation run, the application will be compiled and opened in our default web browser. To run this application, we have two modes, with and without debug mode. So I will go for this without debug mode here. So this is how the fresh MVC application looks like. Before going further, I want to show you the popular accessing ASP.NET Core MVC tutorials from this channel. Most probably you are already looking for best tutorials in these topics. So first of all, user authentication operations like user registration and login are implemented with ASP.NET Core Identity here. And here we have the second video if you want to know how to upload and retrieve images in ASP.NET Core MVC. And here we have this special video. The same CRUD operations from this tutorial is implemented in MVC as a single page application using jQuery Ajax. With single page applications, we can avoid reloading of pages in between. I have given the links to these videos and more videos in video description and inside the first comment of this video. Now, as I mentioned already, in this ASP.NET Core MVC application, we are going to implement the CRUD operations using Entity Framework Core. For that, first of all, we have to install corresponding NuGet packages. So, right-click on this project here, then Manage NuGet packages. Inside this Browse tab, search for Entity Framework Core. So here we have the package Microsoft Entity Framework Core. Now from this version drop down here, select the same version as that of this ASP.NET Core here. To see the framework version, right click on it, then select properties. So here we have the version. So select the same version from this drop down here. Now click on install, accept the license. So here we have successfully installed the package. Along with this package, we have to install these two packages, Microsoft Entity Framework Core tools. And since we are using SQL Server DB for this application, we have to install this package also. So select the same version as that of the Entity Framework Core from this drop down here. Now let's install this SQL Server package. So here we have successfully installed these three Entity Framework Core packages. Now it's time to create a model class for the transaction entity. For that, let's add a C# file here, transaction. Now let's add the corresponding properties one by one. First of all, we have the ID property, transaction ID, account number, beneficiary name, bank name, then we have the SWIFT code or IFSC code, then we have the amount, finally the date of the transaction. Now we want to make this transaction ID property as the primary key, so I will set this key attribute here. To add the corresponding namespace, you can use this shortcut, hold, control, then press period. Now add this namespace data annotations. Now you can see the green squiggle line for these string properties saying we have to make them as nullable, or either we have to initialize them inside the constructor of this class. We'll always be initializing these properties in appropriate places. So just ignore this line, or you could suppress this issue here. Just hover the mouse on the property. Then you could see this downward arrow, click on it, then suppress. For now, let's suppress this issue like this. As you know, this class indicates an entity framework model. We'll be creating the physical table corresponding to this model through migration. So once we do that, the corresponding columns for these string properties will be having n_var_cap_max data type, which is more than what we need. So we have to explicitly mention the data type for these properties accordingly. For that, we can make use of this attribute column. Let's add the corresponding namespace. Inside that, we can do this type name is equal to n_var_char, then specify the number of characters that we need for these properties here. For account number, I will set it as 12. Now let's do the same for rest of the string properties. I will set n_var_char100 for both bank name and beneficiary, expecting maximum 11 characters for SWIFT code internationally. So here we have done with the model class. Let's create a DB context class. For that, let's add a new C# class file called transaction DB context. Now we have to inherit this class from the Entity Framework Core class DB context. Now let's add the corresponding namespace using the shortcut hold, control, then press period or dot simple. Add this namespace Entity Framework Core. Now we need a constructor for this class. For that, we can make use of this snippet CTOR, then double tap. So here we have the constructor for the class. For this constructor class, we need a constructor parameter of the type DB context options, which is of the type transaction DB context. I will name this parameter as options, and we have to pass the same parameter to the base constructor. So we can do this base, and let's pass the same parameter here, options. You will understand the need of this DB context options parameter for this constructor in a bit while explaining the dependency injection once we create our MVC controller. For now, just keep it as it is. So during the migration, this transaction DB context defines or manages what all we need in the physical DB after the migration. So in order to create a table corresponding to this transaction model here, we need a property connecting to the transaction model inside this DB context class here. For that, we'll be creating a property of the type DB set like this, DB set of the type transaction model. And I will name this property as transactions. So after creating the physical DB, the corresponding table for this model will be named as transactions. You will see that in a bit. Now we have to go for the dependency injection of this DB context class. I will do that inside this program.css inside this latest version, but if you are using an old version of ASP.NET Core, you have to do that in startup.cs file. So let's look how we can do the dependency injection, and I will be explaining how this dependency injection works once we create a controller inside this application. Okay, now if you are using a previous version of ASP.NET Core with startup.cs file like this, you have to do this dependency injection inside this method configure services, calling add DB context method from the services of the type iService collection. Okay, to do the dependency injection, we can make use of this builder instance here. So let's do the dependency injection for the context. Builder.services.addDB context method can be called, and here we have to specify the DB context class transaction DB context. Let's add the corresponding model namespace. So with this dependency injection, we are going to create an instance of transaction DB context. Now actually for this class, we have the constructor here. So here we have the constructor, and this constructor is expecting a parameter of the type DB context options. So it should contain the DB connection string along with the DB provider. So with DB provider, we are telling which type of database we are using. In this application, we'll be using SQL Server or SQL Server. We can have other databases also like MySQL, PostgreSQL, etc. So based on the database you are using, the corresponding DB provider should be passed to this constructor parameter here. So let's pass this parameter value options while doing the dependency injection here. For that, I will be using this lambda expression with options. So here we go, options dot use SQL Server function can be called. In order to use this DB provider, we have to add this namespace entity framework core. Now inside this method, we have to pass the connection string for the DB. So first of all, we'll be saving that inside this app settings.json file here. Connection strings, inside that I will be saving the connection string with this name dev connection. Now here we need to provide the DB connection string. If you don't know how to generate the connection string for your database or SQL Server instance, you can look through these articles here. This is from C# Corner, and here we have the official MSDN documentation. I have given these links in video description. You can go through them. For now, I will be pasting the DB connection string template like this. So first of all, we have server, or you could also use this name data source, meaning we have to provide the SQL Server address and its instance name here. So local. In my case, the SQL Server instance is installed on my system itself, so I will be specifying it as local here, and the name of the instance is SQL Express. In order to check the installed SQL Server instance, you can do this. First of all, open run. For that, you can use the shortcut, hold Windows key, then R, then type services.msc. It will open up a window with all the services installed on your system. Search for SQL Server. So here it is, SQL Server. So here we have the name of the instance in parenthesis, SQL Server Express. That's what we have mentioned here. Now make sure that this service is already running. If it is not in running state, instead of these options, you could see a start option. Now back to the connection string here. After server, we have database. So here we have to provide the name of the database. It would be transaction DB. So this DB is not inside this SQL Server here. It will be created through migration. Okay. Instead of this database, we can also use this keyword initial catalog. Data source or server, then database or initial catalog. Then we have to provide the credentials to access the SQL Server instance. Actually, there are two ways to do that. In my case, it is installed on my system itself, so I can use the Windows authentication itself. For that, we just need to set this attribute trusted connection as true. If Windows authentication is not available, it will be only available if the SQL Server instance is installed on your system itself. If Windows authentication is not possible, you have to provide user ID and password. It's all configured while installing the SQL Server instance. In order to execute multiple queries in a batch, we have set this attribute multiple active result sets as true, or you could say MARS. So this is how we specify connection string. Now let's pass this connection string to this method, use SQL Server. For that, we can make use of this builder object like this. get connection string method can be called, and here we have to specify the name of the connection string, which is dev connection. Now we have done everything for the migration, so let's do the migration. Before that, we have to build this project. So right click on the solution, then build solution. After a successful build, open package manager console. In my case, it's already here, package manager console. If you can't see the package manager console there, select the project from the solution explorer like this, then go to tools and you get package manager, then package manager console. Now for the migration, first of all, we have to execute this command, add migration. Then name this migration something like initial create execute. As a result of this command execution, here we have a new folder, migrations. Inside that, we'll be having the C# code corresponding to create the actual physical DB based on our given model here. Now in order to create the actual physical DB, we have to execute these migration codes here. For that, we have to execute another command, update database. So here we have successfully completed with the migration. For some of you, you might be getting this error. Mainly, there are two reasons for this error. First of all, the SQL Server instance is not in running state. So make sure that it is in running state from this services window here. And the second reason is that this connection string is not given in proper format, or the credentials or the SQL Server instance address is not correct. In order to verify that, first of all, you can open the tool of your choice for managing the database. From Visual Studio itself, you can use Server Explorer for connecting to the DB. In my case, I will be using SQL Server Management Studio or SMS here. Then try to connect the SQL Server instance with the same details that we have given inside this DB connection string here. I'm using this instance here, and I'm using Windows Authentication. If you are using SQL Server Authentication, you have to select that from this drop down and then provide the username and password here. If you are able to connect with the instance with the given details here, then the problem is in the generated connection string here. Then check the correctness of the connection string with these articles given in video description. Okay, if you find it difficult, let me know in comment box below. Now let's connect with the DB. Now if you expand databases node here, you could see the new DB, transaction DB, as per we have given inside this connection string here. Inside that, you could see a table corresponding to this model class here. So here we have the DB, let's expand it. So here we have the table transactions. Now let's check its design. So here we have the table and its columns created as per our DB model here. Now back to the project. Now it's time to create an MVC controller for this transaction model here. For that, right click on this controllers folder, then add controller. Now from this left panel here, select controller under MVC. Now select this template, MVC controller with views using entity framework. Click on add. As a model, I will select this transaction model here. And here we have the DB context, transaction DB context. We want to generate the view, reference script libraries, use layout page. We'll be discussing that in a bit. And I will name this controller as transaction controller. Click on add. As you can see here, the scaffolding mechanism here automatically install the NuGet package code generation. For some of you, there might be some problems while creating your first MVC controller in a project for the first time. Most of the time, it is related to installing the code generation package. In this project, the transaction controller is created without any problem. We'll be discussing what is inside this MVC controller in a bit. Before that, I want to address this problem related to installing this package here, code generation, this one here. Now, if you get such an error, go to the NuGet package manager. For that, right click on this project, then click on manage NuGet packages. Now you can search for the package code generation here. Now this is the package that I'm talking about, code generation design. You can check the package here. If it is not present inside this packages here, you have to install that from this package manager here. In some cases, you will get the error related to installing this package code generation design. Even though the package is listed under install packages here, you will get the error. In that cases, you can uninstall and then install it again, meaning you have to reinstall the package again to get rid of the error. Okay, now let me close this package manager here. Now let me collapse these dependencies here and let's focus on this controller, transaction controller. Now this transaction controller is created using scaffolding mechanism, meaning we have provided the model for this controller and the DB context we are using, and thereby it creates action methods of the type get and post, and its corresponding views are added to this views folder here. Under this views folder, you could see a new folder with the same name as that of the created controller. Inside that, we have the views required for each of the action methods here. We'll be discussing each of them in a bit. Before that, I want to discuss about dependency injection that we have discussed before. So here we have the controller, transaction controller, which is inherited from the framework class controller. And here we have the corresponding controller constructor. It has a single parameter transaction DB context. Now, how does this constructor get the value for this constructor parameter of the type DB context? That's where dependency injection comes into the picture. Inside the program.cs file, we have added the dependency injection for the DB context here. So basically, this statement here creates an instance of this class transaction DB context. Into that, we have to pass the connection string and the DB provider that we have passed here. So this will create a complete instance of this transaction DB context. And this created instance will be passed to the constructor of the controllers, which has a constructor parameter of the type transaction DB context. So all the parameters having a constructor with the same parameter transaction DB context, the value or instance of this parameter will be passed from this dependency injection here. We don't have to separately create an instance inside these controllers here. Actually, inside an MVC application, we are not manually creating an instance of this transaction controller here. Whenever we make a request into this controller, the framework automatically create an instance of this controller. At that time, the constructor will be called and the value for this parameter of the type DB context will be passed from this dependency injection here. Now inside this constructor, the instance from the dependency injection is assigned to this private property of the type transaction DB context, and this private object is used in rest of the controller in order to interact with the DB. So hope you understood how dependency injection works in ASP.NET Core MVC applications. Now back to the browser, the application is already running here. In order to reflect the new changes inside this application, we have to build this project again. In latest version of the MVC application, you could see the progress of the build inside this icon here. Once the build is successful, the application will get reloaded automatically. Now let's navigate into this index method of this transaction controller. For that, let's check the existing routing configuration here. First of all, we have to provide the controller by default, which is home. Then action by default is index. If there is any ID parameter, we can pass that at the end like this. In order to access the transaction index method, we could do this transaction. But as per the routing configuration, the default action method is index. So we don't have to provide that inside this URL here. /transaction is enough. So this is the view from our index action method of the transaction controller. So here we have the action method. Inside that, it is returning the view. So here is the corresponding view index.cshtml. The same name of this action method will be used for the corresponding view here. See, CSHTML view here is responsible for this view here. This table is rendered from this HTML here. Okay. If you are frequently watching our latest videos, knows that I always recommend dark mode in order to avoid eye strains from these white screens here. Especially if you are watching this video in night time, you will get a lot of eye strains because of the brightness from these white colors. In order to avoid that, in this web browser, I'm using this extension here, Dark Reader. So I'm going to enable dark mode inside this application. It definitely reduces a lot of eye strains from these white screens here. So let me enable this dark mode. If you want to have a similar experience, you can install this Chrome extension Dark Reader like in my case here. And you can use this extension in any web application which does not have the dark mode by default. Now let's talk about the layout page. Inside this index view here, there is nothing related to layout page. But if you expand this shared folder here, you could see the layout page here. So this is the layout page. It works as a parent view for rest of the views inside the application. Basically inside this view, we have the HTML wrapper for all of the views inside the application. The HTML declaration with head and body tag is rendered from this layout page, and the content from these views is rendered in place of this @render body. Okay. For all the views inside this application, this shared view or layout page will be used as a parent view. This now bar is rendered from this layout page here. If you want to verify that, you can set this layout as empty string. Let's build this project. Now back to the application. Only the HTML from this index view is rendered because we have disabled the layout page. Now let me get rid of this line here. Now inside this layout page head reference, you could see the bootstrap reference here. Along with this bootstrap, for developing this application, I want to use font awesome icons. So let me grab font awesome CDN reference. So let's search for that here. Normally I use the reference from this website cdnjs.com. So for this application, I'm using this version here, and I will copy this all.min.css reference. Let me copy the tag and pasting inside this head reference. Let me save this and back to this index view. Now before customizing this index view, let's start with this create new view, which is responsible for creating new transactions. So this URL here /transaction/create is invoking this action method here, create. So let's start from this action method itself. By default, it is returning the view with the same name as that of this create here. So basically it is returning this create view here. Now the controller that we have created with this scaffolding mechanism has different methods or action methods like create, edit, delete and details, and same in case of these views here. Create or insert operation and update operation is handled with separate views and separate actions. You could see the create, get and post action methods here. And here we have the corresponding view, and here we have the edit view, and you could see the corresponding get and post action methods here. Now in order to avoid the overhead of keeping them as separate, I'm going to merge them into one action method, add or edit. So first of all, I will rename this get create action method as add or edit. I will do the same rename operation for this create view here, add or edit. So the corresponding URL will be like this transaction/add or edit. Now from this get action method, we'll be returning this view add or edit, and into that model we just need to pass a fresh instance of the transaction model. So I will do this new transaction model. So here we have the instance which is passed to this view add or edit, and which is accessed with this model here. Now let's build the solution. Back to the application. Now let's change this URL action method name here to add or edit. First of all, you can see the title here, create bank transaction, which is coming from this view data here, view data title. Inside that we have saved the create. Instead of that, I will pass transaction. So this view data is used inside this layout page here. See, the title for this page is set here. The view data that we have set from our child views is appended with the name of the application here. So here we have the updated title. Now let's customize this view as per our requirement. First of all, I want to center everything from the child views. For that, inside this layout page here, we can use the bootstrap grid system like this. For that, we can do this. Everything inside this div will be using 8 columns from the grid system, and we need an offset of 2 columns. So offset MD2. Now let's move this render body to this div here. Now let me remove this create title here. As you can see, this form is wrapped within this div with the 4 columns. Instead of that, we need 6 columns, and then we need an offset of 4 columns. Now let's move this title into this div here. Now inside this form, you could see a pair of label and input text box field for each of the properties inside the model class that we have defined. First of all, inside this form, we don't need this date input controls, which is the date of transaction that we can pass from our code itself. So first of all, I'll remove that from here. Now these labels are the exact property name from our model classes. Instead of that, we want to customize the label name. For that, we can make use of this attribute display name. So I want to show the corresponding label like this. In between account and number, we need a space like this. Now we have to import the corresponding namespace here. Now let's do the same for rest of the model properties here. Now the labels corresponding to these 2 properties, amount and date, will be shown as it is, so it's fine. Let's build this project and back to the application. So here we have the updated labels. Now I want to show the text boxes for this Swift code and amount in a single line. For that, we could do this. First of all, we'll be having the div with the class row. Inside that, we have two divs with 6 columns each. Now let's move this Swift code into this first half here. Now the amount controls into the second half. After each modification, build the project and then back to the application. Now let me change this title from H4 to H1. So here we have the title H1 and we don't need this horizontal line. Let me remove that. So here we have the div called MD6 and we want to change this offset to call MD3. So 3 plus 6 plus 3 gives 12 columns. Now let's customize this submit button here. First of all, I want to change the button text as submit. And I want to show this hyperlink along with this submit button here. For that, we can do the same like we have done for this Swift code and amount controls here. So we need a row div and 2 columns with same width. So let me copy this and pasting here. Now let me copy paste this for the hyperlink. And here we have the close div for the row. Now let me move this submit button into this first column. Now let's move this hyperlink to this second column here. Now actually this hyperlink is navigating the index action method, which is returning all of the transactions inside the DB. So I will rename this hyperlink text as view all, meaning view all transactions. Now I want to show this like a bootstrap button. So I will copy this class from here and pasting here. Instead of btn primary, we need btn secondary. So here we have those 2 buttons. First of all, we need a top margin. We can have this class M means margin, MT means top margin of the range 2. Now I want to expand these buttons in available space here. For that, we can have this bootstrap class with 100. Now let me copy this and pasting for this view all button. Now if you click on this view all button here, it will be navigating the index action method, which is showing all of the transactions inside the DB. So here we have the index view. Currently there is no transaction inside the DB, so the table is empty. Now if you click on this create new button, it should navigate the add or edit view, right? But actually it is navigating the create action method. It was the previous name. So let's modify that inside this index view. Now in order to navigate through open tabs here, you can use this shortcut, hold Control, then press tab, then keep pressing tab until you reach the tab that you want to open. So in this case, we have to open this view index. So release the hold key. Now let's change this action to add or edit. Back to the previous view, which is the index action method or index view. Now let's reload the view. Now let's try the hyperlink here. It's working perfectly fine. Now let's implement validation inside the form here. That we can do inside the transaction model. Actually, inside this form, everything is mandatory or required for submitting this form. So we could do this. We'll be specifying the required validation with this attribute required. Now we'll copy paste this for rest of the properties. So here we have specified required validation for the properties. Now let's build the project back to the application. Now if you try to submit this form here, you will get the validation errors like this. We'll be customizing this error message in a bit. Before that, I want to talk about how this validation is working. Okay, as I mentioned already, this layout view here is working as a wrapper or a parent view for all of the views inside the application. And inside this layout.cshtml, we have these script files loaded just before the body end tag like this. Along with that, you could see a render section for scripts, meaning child views can make use of this script section to load scripts in this place here. For example, inside this view add or edit, you could see this script section. So this script section is passing this partial view here. You can see the same inside this views here. Inside this shared folder, here we have the partial view validation script partial. If you open that, you could see few script files which are corresponding to jQuery validation. It is present inside this www root under this library folder. Here we have the jQuery validation script files. Actually, these script files are used for client-side script validation. Okay, so this partial view is rendered inside this section, and the scripts inside these sections will be replaced in place of this layout script section here. Okay, that's how scripts are loaded into the layout page from the child views. In this case, we have these script files corresponding to jQuery validation. These are libraries used for client-side validation, meaning this validation is done at runtime. You don't have to submit this form to the server. It will be done at the client side itself because of jQuery validation scripts. You can check that here. Currently, this account number is not valid, and here you can see the corresponding error message. Once we start typing inside this controller here, the error message goes. If you remove everything inside the controller, you can see the corresponding error message like this. So this is what we call client-side validation. So this same validation will be done at server side also. Let me show you that here. So here we have the transaction controller, and this form here is returned from this get action method add or edit. And here we have the view, and here we have the form. This form will be submitted to this action method create. Actually, I want to rename this to add or edit. Okay, now we have to rename the corresponding post action method here. So here we have the post action method create. Let's rename it to add or edit. So the form posted from this view here will be submitted or posted to this action method. Inside the action method, you can see this if clause checking whether this received model is valid or not as per our requirement. So validation is done at both server side and client side. For example, assume that for some reason the client side validation is not working. In that case, the error will be caught at the server side here. Okay. So by default, validation on both ends is done by default in MVC applications. Now let's look how to customize these error messages here. For that, to this required attribute, we can specify the error message like this. This field is required. Now let me copy paste the same for rest of the required properties. Now inside these input text boxes, account number and this Swift code, I want to limit the number of inputs. For that, we can make use of the attribute max length. So for this account number, maximum we can have 12 characters, and here we have the corresponding error message. Now let me copy paste this for Swift code. For Swift code, we can have maximum 11 characters. Let's build the project and back to the application. Now let's submit the form without entering any data. See, here we have changed the error messages for the validation. Now if you click inside this text field, you could see the previously posted data from a similar form. So in order to avoid this, you can set the attribute of the form autocomplete as off. So here we have the form, and let's set this attribute or reset this attribute autocomplete as off. Since we have set maximum number of characters for these two fields, we can't enter more than 12 characters inside this field here. See? And same for this Swift code also. So validation is working properly fine. Now this form is ready to submit the data into this post action method here, add or edit. Now let's start modifying this post action method. Now first of all, in order to access this post action method, the corresponding URL will be like this: transaction/add or edit. Before going forward, I want to make this transaction controller as the default controller. So go to program.cs file here, and let's change this to transaction here. Now back to the post action method here. Now once we submit the form, the data from these form controls can be received with this action method parameter transaction here. First of all, we'll verify the validation of the properties inside the model. Now here we have added the object transaction object from the model into the DB context, and this save changes method will insert the corresponding record into the transaction table. After all, we'll be redirected to the index action method here. It will return a view to display the existing transactions inside the table. So that's all about this post action method. And here we have the last return view statement, and this will be executed if the validation fails, meaning the return transaction model will be having the existing data that we have sent from the model, and along with that we'll be having the error messages as per our model. Now before this insert operation, we have to feed the date of transaction into this date property here. So I will do this: transaction.date is equal to datetime.now. Okay, that's enough for now. Let's make a new transaction. Now let's submit the form. Boom, that's it. So here we are redirected back to the index view, and here we have the newly inserted transaction. You could see the same inside this transaction table here. Let's execute this select query here. So here we have the corresponding record. So all of these columns are populated with the corresponding field data. Now before going forward, let's customize this index view here. This index view is returned from the index action method of the controller here. So here we have the index action method. Inside this action method, the index view is returned. Into that, a list of existing transactions is passed. So here we have the index view, and here we have the passed list of transactions inside the model, and list of transactions are displayed within a table here. And here you could see the for each loop to iterate through the list of transactions. Now inside this table, first of all, I will remove unwanted columns from this table, so which are bank name and SWIFT code. So we have to remove corresponding header cell and body cell. So here we have the header cell. Now let's remove the corresponding body cell also. Now let's show this date column before this amount column here. For that, we just need to change the order in both body part and the header part. Okay, and I want to change this header to something like list of transactions, or I will set it as something like passbook. Now I want to move this create new hyperlink to the last column header cell here. So here we have the hyperlink. Let me cut this and let's get rid of this paragraph here. And here we have the last column header, and let's paste the same here. Now let me apply bootstrap clauses. First of all, we have btn clause btn sm, and let's apply a green background, so btn success. Now along with this text here, I want to show a font awesome icon. For that, go to this website fontawesome.com/icons. Now I will search for this icon plus. I will select this first icon here. Now if you click on this I tag, corresponding code will be copied to the clipboard, and we just need to paste that here. Inside this hyperlink, I just want to show this text new. So this is how it looks like. Now if you want to make a new transaction, you can click on this button here. Corresponding transaction form will be displayed like this. Now you can go back to the list of transactions with this button view all. Now inside this date transaction column here, I want to format this date string. For that, inside this transaction model, we just need to add a new attribute for the property date. So here it is, display format. Into that, we can pass this data format string, and here we go. We need to display the month in 3 digits, so MMM. Then we have 2 digits for day and 2 digits for year. Now it should do the job. Now as we have shown here, we have to deal with update and delete operation. We don't need this details hyperlink here. So first of all, let's get rid of that. So here we have the hyperlink. Let me get rid of this details hyperlink. Now we have to implement both these edit or update operation and this delete operation. So next we are going to implement the edit or update operation. Inside this hyperlink, instead of this text edit, I want to show a font awesome icon like this, corresponding to a pen. Now let's apply some bootstrap clauses, btn, then btn hyphen warning. Now here we have the action method edit, and here we have the ID parameter passed with this transaction ID. Now let's check that inside this transaction controller here. Actually here we have the edit action method of the type get. Like I mentioned before, both insert and update operation will be done with this add or edit get and post action method. So let me get rid of this edit get method and edit post action method. And we don't need this get details action method here. Now let's remove the corresponding view files also. Now we'll be handling the get request for update operation inside this action method add or edit. So I will change this hyperlink action method to add or edit. Now back to the action method add or edit. Here we are already returning a view for insert operation containing a form for insert operation. Now we also need to return a form for the update operation. For that, we can have this ID parameter here. and by default I will set this value as 0. So for insert operation, we won't be passing an ID parameter. For example, inside this create new hyperlink here, we are not passing any ID parameter here with this hyperlink. So the ID parameter will be having the value 0. But in case of this update operation here, we'll be passing a non-zero ID value for the update operation like this here. Okay. So based on the value of the ID parameter, we can say whether we have an insert or update operation. So I will do this. We will be having this if clause. If ID is equal to 0, we'll be returning a fresh form for the new transaction. If there is a non-zero value inside the ID, we can handle that inside this else part here. Now we just need to copy this return statement from here and let's paste that here. Now instead of passing a fresh transaction instance for update operation, we have to pass an existing transaction for the given ID. For that, we could do this. Here we have the DB context. Inside that we have the list of transactions. From that we just need to call this function find, and here we just need to pass the ID. So this will return the corresponding transaction record and it will be passed to the view which is this add or edit view here. Now rest of the things can be handled inside this view here. Now we want to make few modifications inside this view in order to incorporate update operations inside this same form where we have already implemented the insert operation. Now before doing that, let's verify the working of this get action method for update operation here. So build the project, back to the application. Now if you click on this edit button here, it should make a get request to this add or edit action method here. Let's try that. Boom, that's it. So here we have the get request URL that we have just made with the hyperlink, and it returns a transaction form populated with the corresponding transaction details for this transaction ID here. Now after making record changes to this form, we can submit the form for updating the details. As you already know, this form will be submitted to this action method add or edit of the type post. Inside that we have already handled the insert operation. Now we also need to handle update operation also. Before that, I want to make few changes inside this form appearance here. I want to switch this label text and this button text to uppercase. For that, we can make use of the global CSS file, which is there inside this www.root CSS folder here. So here it is, site.css. So at the end, I will be adding this custom CSS here. We will transform the text case to uppercase for label text and the button text of the type submit. Along with this, I want to change the color of the label to gray. So I will do that here. Color is equal to gray. Changes inside this style sheet does not need a rebuild of this project. It will be reflected immediately inside this project here. Now let's implement the update operation with this action method here. In order to check whether we have an insert or update operation, we can check the transaction ID. If it is equal to 0, we can say we have an insert operation. In that case, we have to update this date to current date, and then we have to add the model into the context. If we have an update operation, we can handle that inside this else part here. We just need to call the update method. So let me copy this and pasting here. Instead of this add method, we just need to call this update. Independent of whether we have an insert or update operation, at the end, we just need to call this save changes method here. Now we have to be careful about one thing. Inside this get action method for the update operation, we have returned the view with the existing transaction details. Now when we submit the same from this form here, corresponding properties with the updated values will be submitted to this action method here. But here we are missing something. Inside this form, we don't have form controls for properties like transaction ID and the date of transaction. So when we submit this form, the properties like transaction ID and date won't be reached up to this post action method here. So the value of transaction ID and date will be null. In order to avoid this problem, we can add hidden fields for such properties. So I will do this. We can add hidden fields like this. Input of the type hidden. This is for transaction ID. So we can do this ASP for transaction ID. Like this, we need one more hidden field. So let me duplicate this. And this time we have a date hidden field. So this hidden fields will be having the values that we have passed from this get action method here. The same value will be reached inside this post action method when we submit the form. So everything is ready for the update operation. Let's build this project, back to the application. let's make visible updates inside these form controls to make sure that update operation is working for all of these fields here. Now let's submit the form. Boom, that's it. So you could see the updated values here. If you want to verify that, you can go into this management studio, re-execute the select query here. That's it. Next, we are going to implement delete operation. Before that, let me add 2 more transactions here. Now let's do this delete operation here. For that, back to the transaction controller. For delete operation, we have 2 action methods here. One of the type get and other is post. And here we have the corresponding view for delete operation. In order to simplify this process, I will be removing this delete view here. In our previous tutorial, we don't have this post action method. We have done the delete operation inside this delete get action method. And one of our friend is raised this question, isn't it unsafe to delete records using get action methods? It's actually unsafe. If we implement the delete operation with get action methods, we can delete records by making a get request like this. We just need to enter the URL here like this. If the delete operation is implemented within this get action method delete, then the corresponding record will be deleted. So it's not a best practice to implement delete operations with get action methods. So in this tutorial, we are going to implement delete operation with a post action method. We can't make post requests from directly entering the URL here. It can be only made with a form submit event. So that's what we are going to do here. So first of all, I'm going to add a form element here. Inside that, I will add a button of the type submit. Now inside this button, instead of a text, I will be showing this font awesome icon for a trash bin. Now let me assign few bootstrap classes here, btn, then btn danger. Now let's specify the action method. So we could do that with this attribute ASP action. So it will be delete. Along with that, we have to pass the transaction ID through this ID parameter like this here. So let me copy this from this hyperlink and pasting here. Now we don't need this delete hyperlink. Let me remove that from here. Now back to the transaction controller. We'll implement the delete operation with this post delete action method here. So let me remove this get delete action method here. So here we have the method delete confirmed, and here we have set the route or action name as delete. So in order to make the request into this action method, we have to use this URL here. So that's what we have specified inside this form here. Inside this form, we only have one single button for the delete operation. Now this action method already contains the code for delete operation. We don't need this method transaction exists. Let me remove that from here. So here we have the action method for delete operation. First of all, we will find the transaction with the given ID, and we will remove the item from the DB set transactions. And finally, we just need to call this method save changes. And finally, we will be redirected to the index view to show the updated list of transactions. Now back to the index view again. Boom. So here we have the submit button for the delete operation. Don't worry about the orientation of this button. We'll fix that in a bit. So as soon as we click this button, delete button, the post action method will be invoked. Before that, we want to make a confirmation from user side because delete is a loss of data. So before actually executing the operation, we'll ask for user confirmation. For that, we can implement this on click event here. Inside that, we could do this. We'll call this JavaScript method confirm. Inside that, we will ask this question, are you sure to delete this record? So this will prompt a dialog. If user confirm the operation with yes, then this function will return true, and then the form submit event will be triggered. So this is the best practice to implement delete operations with post action methods. Now before actually testing this delete operation here, I want to make the proper arrangement of these buttons here. I want to show these 2 buttons in a single line. For that, first of all, I will move this edit hyperlink to this form here. Now in order to align them in the same row, we can make use of the bootstrap button group. You could see the similar examples here. For that, we just need to wrap these 2 buttons with a div like this. Class is equal to btn group. Now in order to set smaller size for these buttons, we can add this class btn group sm. Finally, before testing the delete operation, I want to shrink the width allocated for this table here. So back to the index view. First of all, we need a div with the class row. Inside that, we can have this div allocating 8 columns from the grid, an offset of 2 columns. Now let's try to delete this record here. For that, you can click on this delete icon here, and here we have the confirmation. Are you sure to delete this record? So if I cancel this confirmation, nothing will happen. If you confirm the operation, boom, that's it. The list of transaction is refreshed. So that's it guys. Here we have implemented insert, update and delete with ASP.NET Core MVC latest version 6 using Entity Framework Core DB-first approach. I have given the GitHub repository link for this project in video description. You can either download or clone the project from the given repository. If you found this video helpful, please consider subscribing to this channel CodAffection if you haven't yet. Please like and share this video with your friends and colleagues so that they can also benefit from this. Have a nice day. See you in next video.